The New Founding Fathers of America are the fictional political party known for creating The Purge. On their website, they mention some of the crime sprees in human history that led up to their inception. They include a 1971 riot at a New York prison, the Jonestown Massacre in 1978, the Edmond, Oklahoma post office incident in 1986, and the LA riots in 1992. Those are all real events, so it seems 2014 is where the fictional timeline starts to diverge from our own. From 2014, they mention two crime sprees, the Queensbridge incident and the Covina Alley murders, as events that incited a public outcry for protection and vengeance against the increasing number of homeless. It's not clear if there was an actual outcry against the homeless or if the NFFA just said that as part of their agenda. Either way, it worked, and they began to gain popularity due in part to huge donations from the National Rifle Association, who sought to protect themselves from the growing movements to ban firearms.
A new party is arising as a substitute to the Republicans and Democrats, calling themselves the New Founding Fathers of America.
2014 was the year that the NFFA was founded, probably hoping to capitalize on a time of great civil unrest. To learn all about their history as detailed in the now defunct NFFA website and how it gives a greater meaning to the events seen in the Purge movies and TV series, stick around to the end of this video. Welcome to Horror History. Today we'll be studying a new kind of history as I cover the New Founding Fathers of America. It's impossible to talk about them without also covering the history of what they consider their crowning achievement, the annual Purge. The New Founding Fathers were named to bring thoughts of America's original founding fathers, who united the colonies of America in 1776. They are also sometimes known as the NFA, the New Founders of America for short. The NFFA managed to stay in power for nearly a quarter of a century, so we've got a lot to cover. Let's get into it. The NFFA's policies have aspects of many real political parties, but their hidden long-term agenda is profiteering by eliminating the lower class, which they see as being below them. Some of their policies don't seem so bad, but they use sneaky language to hide their true intent. For example, they claim to support equal opportunity, but exclude those that they don't consider contributing citizens. In other words, employers can't discriminate against you for being homeless, but they can discriminate against you for not contributing to society, aka being jobless. Their most controversial stance, of course, is their stance on crime. They claim that aggression is a part of human nature that needs to be released, so they planned a science experiment called the Purge to see if overall crime could be reduced by containing it all to one night. More on that later. They support an investment in eco-technology to keep the environment clean. I mean, that's good, I can get behind that one, but even here we see that they can't help but mention that this is all part of an overall cleanse, which involves their idea of cleansing out those that are less fortunate. On the topic of national security, they plan to reinstate the military draft in 2023 to offset the drop in enlistment by impoverished people, and also believe that serving in the armed forces will better prepare the youth for purging at home. This is one of those details that's disturbing in so many different ways. The most messed up part is that it seems to be part of their effort to brainwash the country's youth into becoming killing machines, which we'll see more of with their new policies a few years later. It seems like the incentive here is to keep people battling each other, not battling the government. Their take on personal security really shows their ulterior motives if we analyze it. Their idea of security has more to do with arming yourself with dangerous weapons than creating preventative measures. It's very telling that their solution to violence is more violence, and it is perhaps the first clue that they're under the thumb of the gun manufacturing industry, a fact that is used against them more and more as time goes on. Finally, we have their policy on science and technology. This is perhaps the most puzzling. They claim to be working with other countries to protect the US from China's recent advancements in space exploration, artificial intelligence, and rejuvenation research. Artificial intelligence can be used maliciously, and it is, but why do we need to protect ourselves from space exploration and rejuvenation? There's something a little fishy about that. In the time leading up to the NFFA taking power, unemployment continued to rise. People were protesting and asking for well-paying jobs and an end to police brutality, multiple wars, and a significant dollar devaluation.
Unemployment rising across the nation.
Stock market down another 2,000 points and the largest drop in its history.
A subprime mortgage crisis worse than 2008.
Neighborhoods across the country destroyed by an opioid epidemic.
Protests across the nation. Americans are looking for a necessary change in these tumultuous times.
It seems they first gained office in 2014 with the election of President Bracken. I guess the election cycle in the world of the Purge does not line up with that of the real world, where the new terms began in 2013 and 2017.
As your elected president, with my fellow new founding fathers, we make this promise. We will revive this country. The American dream is dead. We will do whatever it takes to let you dream again.
Just months later, Bracken institutes a controversial experiment, one night of legalized crime in Staten Island known as the Purge, with the idea that people can get their anger out and it will actually reduce crime overall for the rest of the year. Interestingly, this solution doesn't have anything to do with any of the problems people have been upset about. The NFFA's chief of staff, Arlo Sabian, helped push the Purge experiment through Congress, effectively helping put it into law. It's not entirely clear when this occurs. In Anarchy, we find out that the 2023 Purge is the 6th annual Purge.
The 6th annual Purge will begin in 45 minutes.
Meaning the first annual Purge would have been in 2018. But we also see in the opening of the original movie that there are nationwide purges in both 2017 and 2018. The experimental Purge only took place on Staten Island, suggesting that it took place 1 year before in 2016.
We're considering a nationwide purge, as the people are now calling it, as early as next year.
So that leaves the question. If the first experimental Purge took place in 2016 and the first annual Purge took place in 2018, what was this nationwide Purge in 2017? I'm guessing there was a second experimental Purge that year. The movie The First Purge refers to the experiment as the first experimental Purge, which would suggest that there was a second experimental Purge. This time it would be a nationwide experiment. So Bracken took office in 2014 and planned the first experimental Purge to take place in 2016. But they would have to employ some dirty tactics to get this project rolling. The NFFA takes the public's perception of this experimental Purge very seriously, going so far as to hold auditions for the perfect voice actress to announce its commencement.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual Purge sanctioned by the US government.
Notice how even before they've run their experiments, the NFFA is already planning to make the Purge an annual event. Evidence that they never planned to wait for the data from this experiment. They already had their minds made up that they'd be going forward with it in future years. The proposition divides the country even further, and protests break out nationwide, including conflict between anti-Purge protesters and those who support the idea of the Purge in North Carolina, which resulted in at least 20 arrests. This controversy, which I remind you is a fictional one, becomes a worldwide issue. The Pope condemns the idea, and the President of France calls for a trade embargo with the US if the experiment is not stopped. Remember, the NFFA, like a generic hip-hop video, is all about money, and they would use it to make sure the Purge experiment sends the message that they want it to send. They recruited citizens to participate in the Purge to try to prove to the rest of the country that humans naturally need to release their violence. But rather than rely on their hypothesis, they interfere by offering money to low-income citizens who decide to stay on Staten Island during the experiment for a payment in the amount of $5,000, with additional incentives for those who participate themselves. The proposal was put to vote for Staten Island citizens, and because the majority of the population was in a dire financial situation, they voted yes on it, much to the dismay of many pacifists. The sign-up stations are strategically placed near low-income housing projects to try to get the most desperate people to participate. Staten Island is also the home of numerous street gangs that they want to coax into participating. To try to increase their credibility, Sabian brings on a behavioral scientist named Dr. May Updale to run the experiment.
I do not work for the NFFA. I did not conceive of the experiment for them. The NFFA had the courage to test it, but the conceit is not a political one, it is a psychological one. The benefit of acting violently without worry of consequence, that's a freeing violence.
However, the NFFA has no plans to run a legitimate experiment, as Dr. Updale would soon find out. Each participant who shows up to Purge is given a box with a few items. The blue Batesia flowers, meant to be a symbol of rebirth. A baptism is a religious ceremony of cleansing and rebirth, but in this case, the NFFA is celebrating the violent rebirth of the nation. They also supply recording contact lenses. Participants are told these will document their actions so that they can get paid. But their main purpose is to broadcast the night's events out to the rest of America, helping push the NFFA's violence is a release narrative. They also implant a tracking device on the Purgers. Again, while this seems to be for making sure the person actually stayed on the island, these are actually in place for the government to easily track down and purge anyone they see unfit for their society. Arlo Sabian has a backup plan in case organic participation doesn't live up to his expectation, and he won't accept any result other than the one that he planned for. The NFFA surrounds the island with military forces, ensuring nobody can get off the island once the purge is begun, because that would not fit their narrative. They want to make it look like everyone has just been waiting their entire lives to purge and sell the idea that the country as a whole is excited for it. Sabian and Updale keep tabs on the happenings of the purge in a high-tech NFFA facility nearby, and watch as President Bracken gives an address before the first sirens sound. The beginning of the purge doesn't go as Sabian had hoped. There's graffiti, there's public drinking, but there's very little violent crime. The only fatal purge coming from a man who goes by Skeletor, who is already very mentally unstable. Upon seeing it, Sabian's top priority is getting it out for all of the media to see. There are a couple of traps set in the street, but they don't turn out to be a real threat, and the evening goes on. There's an armed robbery, but again, no lives are lost. Frustration sets in for Arlo Sabian.
There's nothing happening.
Look at this. Some kind of block party.
Parties? Are you kidding me?
Skeletor claims another victim at the block party, causing Updale to believe that it's starting, but it's still an overall disappointing showing for Sabian.
You predicted a much higher level of participation.
We should have expected the unexpected. This is an experiment. There are variables.
The NFFA put a lot of faith into this evening. If it's deemed ineffective, the entire regime could be judged as a failure.
I told you that science does not obey the laws of politics. My job is to analyze this data, nothing more.
Sabian has seen enough and resorts to Plan B. The NFFA has secretly recruited violent groups such as the KKK and hired them to come in to artificially increase the amount of purging in order to make it look like regular citizens had purged. Suddenly, there are purgers everywhere, and Updale can't figure out why.
All data supported early violent behavior and then a downturn. This doesn't make any sense.
Sabian warns her not to question it, but of course, that only makes her more suspicious. She discovers that after being dispatched from an abandoned factory in the area, they all drove directly to the most crowded areas. This causes Updale to realize that they must have had access to the data from the tracking chips implanted on the people who stayed on the island. In other words, these weren't just gangs, they were NFFA hired. But before she can expose this information to the public, her snooping around is discovered by Sabian.
You're making it look like people are participating because there wasn't enough purging.
He explains that he only did it because there was too much overpopulation, crime, unemployment, and bankruptcy, arguing that the country can't afford to care for its own citizens, though she doubts that the NFFA's statistics on such things are even accurate at this point.
Come on. We both know there's no easy answer where somebody, some group, doesn't suffer.
He tells her that her country will remember her fondly and has his thugs abduct her and drop her off in the middle of the purge where a group of NFFA henchmen are waiting. Meanwhile, down on Staten Island, one of the gang leaders mobilizes his men to try to take the mercenaries out, which still plays into the NFFA's hands. They're still accomplishing their mission as long as a lot of fighting takes place, and things were about to go down. Another tactic the NFFA uses to try to create the impression of greater participation in the experiment is using attack drones to try to take people out. By doing this, they could eliminate those that they don't see fit, while easily hiding the fact that they were piloting the drones, making it look like the work of any random citizen. The majority of the country never discovers that the whole experiment was corrupt, but those who fought for their lives that night decide to start a resistance, and they would be the earliest seeds of what would eventually grow into the NFFA's biggest detractors. Ironically, Arlo Sabian runs with the narrative that the turnout was bigger than they expected, when really the opposite had been true. He promises to study the results, and President Bracken announces that they're considering a nationwide purge as early as next year.
One where every U.S. citizen can participate.
Before that would occur, the NFFA installs speakers every 3.7 blocks across the country, so that everyone can hear the sirens announcing the beginning and end of each purge. They also put together surveillance teams in each city to document all of the activity that happens during the nationwide experiments. These surveillance agents, formerly known as the Visual Analytics Departments, become known as the Eyes in the Sky, and they are mostly there to enforce the few rules that do still exist on Purge Night, and to prosecute anyone whose crimes don't come to a stop as the final siren sounds. Of course, they don't have an agent to keep an eye on every single purger, but with the help of an artificial intelligence system, the agents that they do have can monitor any activity that looks suspicious. On March 14th, 2017, 1 week before the first national purge, an NFFA team in New Orleans has a little bit of trouble gaining access to their secure safe room and in a panic called James Sandin, the head and top salesman of Sandin Security who installed their system. This interaction shows that the NFFA doesn't even believe in their own policies. They claim that allowing citizens to own firearms is the best personal security solution. What would people say if they saw how nervous this guy was when he couldn't get into his reinforced safety room surrounded by bulletproof glass? We only see surveillance footage of this 2017 nationwide purge experiment, but can assume that it played out in a similar way to the Staten Island experiment, with the NFFA interfering to ensure optimal participation. It was likely not long after that when the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, ensuring that the purge would be a yearly right to all American citizens. The bill contains 5 sections. Notes that the NFA website uses June 7th as the date of the purge in order to promote the release date date of the movie, so I'll just go ahead and change that screenshot to show the correct dates. Section 1. The annual purge shall begin each year on March 21st at sunset, officially starting at 7 p.m. and ending at sunrise March 22nd at 7 a.m. Section 2. During the time of the purge, any and all crime, up to and including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and hospital aid will be unavailable until the purge concludes. Section 3. The following weapons cannot be used during the purge: weapons of mass destruction, fragment-producing explosives higher than a hazard class HCD 1.4, and viral contagion projectiles. Section 4. Government officials of ranking 5 and higher have been granted immunity from the purge and shall not be harmed. Section 5. Non-compliance with any of the aforementioned rules will result in death by hanging. It's never stated why the purge takes place at night, but it's probably as simple as the fact that crime is more likely to take place under the cover of darkness, and the NFFA feels that recording technology is good enough to be able to identify people in low light conditions. The weapon restrictions seem to have more detail on the website, whereas the PSA in each movie simply refers to weapons class 4 and lower. There are other rules that aren't mentioned in the PSA or the initial iteration of the website, like the fact that there's a legal purging age of 13. That is, you have to be 13 to purge, but there's no age requirement for being purged. For whatever reason, purge travel is tax deductible, but weapons and security aren't, at least not yet. The immunity for government officials wasn't present for the Staten Island experiment, probably because there were no government officials staying on the island for that purge, so it must have been instituted for the nationwide experiment. This restriction would continue to change as time would go on. The website mentions more of the same lies that we've already discussed, but it also mentions the organization's plans for education. The future of our new America relies on our children. Over the next 4 years, we'll be working with states to implement the Federal Purge Preparation Program, or PPP, in all schools, as we believe a quality education is necessary for our youth to become the contributing citizens of tomorrow. I already mentioned how the NFFA wants to brainwash the next generation of kids by making them believe that purging is important to their well-being. It's also around this time that the NFFA fund propaganda-filled children's programming, teaching children that the purge is a holiday to help grown-ups get their worries out.
By giving them one night to do whatever they want. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn.
As I mentioned, the blue Batesia flower had become the symbol of rebirth, so in 2018 they would officially designate it as a sign of support for the purge, resulting in hundreds of thousands of people displaying them in their yards. With a few purges now having taken place, America's population went down, causing the NFFA to introduce their immigration policy. This policy uses more tricky language to mislead people. It allowed for open borders, but not really, because they say those deemed undesirable by the populace will be purged as such. There had already been accusations of racial inequality by the NFFA during the Staten Island experiment because the demographics of the neighborhoods that were hit the hardest had darker skin, but this new immigration policy pretty much confirmed it. In 2019, something called the Great Integration occurred. Led by the NFA, it eliminated party line bickering and established the highest political consensus since the nation's first hours of independence. There was also a law called the Contributing Citizens Provision of 2019, which, as I mentioned earlier, appears to ban discrimination, but contains the caveat that they must be what the NFFA defines as contributing citizens. The year 2020 saw the establishment of the Purge Injury and Disability Act. Their take on healthcare is very similar to their take on civil rights. They plan to provide healthcare, but only to those who don't really need that much healthcare. This is a money-saving scheme which impacts those with disabilities and those with injuries, especially if they can't afford treatment of their own. A big kicker here is that there's only one area that's truly immune to the purge: the hospital. The desire to only permit the survival of those who fit their view of what a perfect ideal human looks like is very similar to the Nazis' idea of only having a single Aryan race. We've already seen them working with the KKK, and the NFFA would also attract neo-Nazis for those same reasons. 2020 was also the year that a bill was introduced to the US Senate that would extend the length of the purge from 12 to 18 hours. Despite several years of trying, this bill was never passed, though I should note that the NFFA dominated the Senate at this point, as this was after the Great Integration, so the bill was going to be debated within the new Founding Fathers party. Senator Charles Bixby from California was one of the politicians that supported the extension, while Roger Ellis from Texas opposed it. They continued their conquest to brainwash the youth in 2021 with the American Historical Act, which legally ensured that all students be taught the history and perspective necessary to, as they put it, understand the pre-purge ills which nearly collapsed this great nation. Basically, they're gonna make sure that all schools tell their students that the purge saved the country, making it look like an indisputable fact that the annual evening of mayhem is actually a good thing.
Well, we studied the history of tonight in history.
The time leading up to the 5th annual purge in 2022 would be some of the NFFA's busiest and most dastardly years, as they continue to take action behind the scenes to manipulate the American people. By the conclusion of the 4th annual Purge in 2021, the NFFA had a massive legion of sheep-like followers that would listen to anything they had to say just because it was coming from the NFFA. Whichever side you're on, I'm sure you probably think that sounds familiar. The new founding fathers would take to the internet to further push their agenda by taking great lengths to make the Purge seem like a normal, patriotic holiday. They post red, white, and blue martini recipes on their blog and give out tips for an environmentally friendly purge. Gotta give them respect where due for sticking with the whole environmentally friendly thing. I mean, there aren't too many evil organizations that'll do that for us. They brag about their impressive numbers when it comes to low unemployment. The rate is down to 1%, but it's not because they fixed the economy, but rather because the unemployed can't afford to protect themselves on purge nights. If they aren't alive, they aren't unemployed. An official report by the Founders Economic Advisory projected that this year's purge could reduce unemployment to an unprecedented low of 0.85%. They try to make it look like this is because of new jobs created by the purge preparation industry, but remember, because of their 2019 provisions, the ones who need jobs under the NFFA regime aren't really the ones that are getting those jobs. Thanks to their government intervention, and thanks to their skewing of collected data, releasing the beast during the purge was becoming more and more popular, and the NFFA, backed by the behemoths of the gun industry, always have financial incentive to make it bigger. They post tips on literally dressing to kill, making their murder-promoting propaganda seem as innocuous as a basic fashion blog. The blog also explores combat rituals from other cultures in an attempt to make the United States' yearly night of legal violence seem a little bit more normal. They also try to convince people that science says violence is essentially part of our DNA, that it's natural for us to want to release our anger. The study is conducted by Dr. Peter Bynax, who I've theorized is under the thumb of the NFFA, and after seeing the fate of Dr. Updale, it's easy to see why he might comply. They also air his interviews on TV, giving Americans the false impression that purging will solve their problems.
Countrywide catharsis creates psychological stability by letting us release the aggression we all have inside of us.
In Michigan, the government reuses a tactic from Staten Island, offering $250 per purge bounty. But of course, only if you're employed full-time. They couldn't have the homeless taking advantage of that. 2022 also marked the 5th consecutive year that crime rates went down. However, those numbers may need to be taken with a grain of salt, seeing as how they come from the New Founders Institute of Justice. It seems that no organization is safe from the New Founding Fathers' reach and corruption, including the Postal Service. Imagine living in a world where the government tries to corrupt the Postal Service. If the numbers are to be believed though, this is likely the height of the public support for the purge, with 88% supporting the 28th Amendment. Finally, the government immunity is decreased for the next purge. Where previously all officials of rank 5 and above were granted immunity, now you would have to rank at least 10 to receive immunity. And no, I don't know what that means, but I do know that US senators and anything higher than that are still protected. When March 21st finally arrived, the purge once again received record participation. One family in California, which happens to be the family of the security mogul that I mentioned earlier, James Sandin, has a tumultuous purge night when their teenage son lets in a homeless man being chased by a group of purgers. They break in, and ultimately James and a few of his neighbors lose their lives, but the homeless man, Dante Bishop, is saved and vows to put a stop to the NFFA. That morning, hundreds of people gather in Times Square for a public vigil to thank all of those that were killed to make the country a safer place. A demonstration of how the NFFA's manipulation of public opinion is working. But the markets continue to soar, at least for gun and security system companies, which of course all benefits the dystopian political party. They would put this newfound income to use in their marketing department. As part of an attempt to seamlessly intertwine their party and the purge with American culture, they revamp their website and release a line of purge paraphernalia. We're talking shirts, hats, bumper stickers, and koozies. I know I'm not supposed to talk about real politics, so I'll just say, wow, this was accurate. They also try to get in with the pop culture crowd by working with Hollywood star Lacey D. Montgomery. Her interview appeared in a January 2023 issue of We Weekly magazine, where she discussed her plans for the upcoming purge. They also do their weapon manufacturer friends a favor by publishing a list of the top 5 gadgets for purging, the most unsettling of which is an app called Finders Keepers that can monitor the GPS location of any cell phone that's turned on during the purge, making it easy for purgers to find and kill their enemies, or friends. One of the most deceptive political tactics used by the NFFA is making the public feel like they're in control, when in fact, they could not be more subjected to a near totalitarian rule. We saw that in 2016 when they allowed Staten Island to vote on if they wanted to host the purge experiment, and we see it again as they allow their followers to go online to vote on potential new measures to add to the purge. However, if you read them, you may notice that these are all measures that benefit the NFFA, with one possible exception. I'll list them from most popular to least popular and explain how they help the NFFA and harm the average citizen. Measure D. Make Purge and Purge security expenses tax deductible. This would encourage more spending on Purge-related items, which means these sellers can donate more money to the NFFA, making them more powerful. It would also probably cause prices to increase, making it even harder for the poor to defend themselves. Measure C. Raise the legal purging age from 13 to 16. 13 to 15-year-olds make up about 19% of fatalities on Purge nights. It benefits the NFFA for them to survive long enough to be able to buy their own weapons. Since they can't work until they're at least 16, the older demographic is more likely to purchase a gun. Measure G. Allow state governments to pass local purge laws. This is the one exception that I mentioned, but it could also benefit the NFFA if it means they're able to pass new legislation faster without having to go through the federal government. Measure F. Loosen weapon restrictions. More weapons, more purging. Measure E. Ban disguises. This would make it easier for the eyes in the sky to find the enemies of the NFFA so they can be taken out. Measure B. Replace the failed Social Security scheme with a contribution-based purge pension plan. This reduces the NFFA spending on the elderly, who they don't care about because they're unlikely to purge. And Measure A. Extend the annual purge hours. A longer purge means more purging can take place. It's not known if any of these measures were ever put into law, but the new founding fathers' next venture would see them for the first time meddling in the video game industry. In the months leading up to the 6th annual Purge, shooting galleries were crowded with people looking to get in some practice before the big night, leading many to find alternate forms of practice. Brown University did a study on the effect of video games on handgun accuracy, and found that first-person shooters can help improve a person's aim and response time by 15% and 30% respectively. The new founding fathers ran with this idea, publicizing these stats to help encourage gamers to rise up on Purge nights.
You don't seem to understand that there are skills that CSGO teaches you that school just can't teach.
There's also a Purge arcade game that goes into development. It's not entirely clear to what extent the NFFA is involved, but you just know that they probably had a hand in anything that glorifies the Purge, such as this Purge student art initiative backed by the wife of new founding father J. Adam Swift, where a 4th grader won $1,000 for writing a haiku that promoted the Purge. The final statement the group made before the 2023 Purge was in response to a group of internet videos created by a resistance fighter named Carmelo Johns, claiming that his group would be fighting back against the NFFA this year. The NFFA falsely claimed that they'd investigated this threat and found that the video traced back to a lone individual, not an organization. The reason that they claimed the rebellion was a hoax was to discourage any of their opponents to try to join it, and to fit their narrative that the Purge is a good thing for the country, a now beloved holiday tradition. As they have since the Staten Island experiment 7 years before, the NFFA would send their own people out into this year's Purge to supplement the purging. However, things get out of hand in Los Angeles, where Carmelo Johns and his men take out an entire truck full of the NFFA's mercenaries. An ex-cop named Leo Barnes also gives them trouble, taking out several NFFA-hired purgers and saving 4 would-be victims. To make matters worse, Johns hacks into the NFFA's Purge countdown stream at the halfway point and delivers a message about the true purpose of the Purge.
Profit making is not the essence of democracy. Wake up, people. Wake up! It's time to take a stand. Tonight, we write our message in blood.
At the end of the night, the rebellion breaks into a Purge gala where rich donors pay absurd amounts of money to hunt down homeless people and other people who have been captured on the streets in a controlled environment. Johns, Dante Bishop, and several others spoil the whole party. But outside of this hiccup in LA, the night is once again an overall success for the administration in power, once again taking the title as the deadliest Purge. I was about to call it the Purgiest Purge, but that just sounds kind of silly. But this may have been a contributing factor to the opening of a Purge Memorial Park in Washington, D.C. in spring of 2024. Citizens could order a brick to commemorate their support for the NFFA or the loss of a loved one during the Purge. Yet another grim example of the group using killing to drive sales and profits. They would eventually take this one step further by instituting a yearly Remembrance Day to honor those who lost their lives during the Purge.
This weekend is a time to honor and celebrate those great martyrs who gave their lives for our country.
Thank you for your sacrifice.
Take time this holiday to remember there is no greater act of service than to give your life for our great nation.
This subconsciously encourages people to go out during the Purge, because if they do lose their lives, they can at least be remembered as heroes. Remembrance Day would take place on June 21st, 3 months after the annual Purge. Over the next several years, the rebellion is still working behind the scenes, but most of the country has basically begrudgingly accepted the Purge as a part of life. In order to continue to prove to their supporters that the Purge is working, and to keep their detractors living in fear, the NFFA must continue to find new ways to increase participation year after year. We've seen them tie the Purge into many aspects of life, life, like pop culture and religion, and it wouldn't be long before it also leaked into business. Since the NFFA's policies help the rich get richer, many of their biggest supporters are extremely wealthy and hold Purge night parties where their biggest business deals of the year are done, using the opportunity to pressure their business partners into joining up with the NFFA and maybe even do a little purging themselves. On the flip side, it's been well established that the NFFA's biggest targets are the homeless, sick, and vulnerable. In other words, the people who require care that requires government spending.
The NFFA doesn't care about protecting drug addicts and alcoholics. We have to lock down like everyone else.
But they aren't just denying them protection, they're also actively working on programs to see that these people are purged. In New Orleans, at some point, they hired a social worker named Tavis to form a sham religion called the Mercy Cult. She would meet these recovering teens at their lowest point and convince them that they can cleanse their souls and become gods and goddesses by giving themselves up, by stepping out of their flesh to enter the invisible.
Purify my flesh, prepare my soul. The beginning is near, the invisible awaits.
She convinces them that their souls are irreparably damaged by the drug use, and giving their lives is the only way to cleanse themselves. These kids were also easy targets, because having just come out of rehab, they would have no access to the caregivers that they had grown accustomed to. So they were even more inclined to find something else to lean on, someone who seemed to care for them.
I will be your guide into the invisible, where there is no pain, only love.
Tavis dubbed herself as the good leader of the cult and created a whole program where she would teach kids how to prepare themselves for the invisible. Once they got older and reached their late teens, they would graduate from yellow robes to light blue ones that matched the official color of the NFFA and the blue batesias that represent rebirth or baptism. On the eve of their giving, they are to shower, another symbol of the cleanse. They spend the afternoon joining together in prayer, and she leads them to a light blue school bus. But this was no game of Fortnite. Every purge, the bus would travel around the city, making several stops, and at each one, the cult would chant in prayer as Tavis would select one victim. She would pretend to be some kind of shaman who could receive messages from the invisible, telling her whose turn it was at each stop. Then that person would get off the bus where a group of purgers was waiting, and the rest of the group would watch as the person is either purged or taken somewhere where they would later be purged. It's not known exactly how long Tavis ran this cult or how many innocent teens lost their lives as a result of this, but it comes to an end during the 10th annual Purge in 2027. Actually, it seems they weren't entirely sure about the date with this stuff, but it makes more sense that this document would be the mistake rather than the computer for their security system being wrong. Anyway, a Marine named Miguel Guerrero comes home looking for a sister and tracks down the Mercy Cult bus. Tavis's affiliation with the NFFA is exposed and she falls victim to the Purge. However, this was most likely just one chapter of this cult in one city, so it was probably just a small L for the new founding fathers, not a total victory royale, but not a bad finish either. The next known activity occurs during the 19th annual Purge, when an NFFA surveillance agent named Esme Carmona notices some strange activity in District 2 of New Orleans. While on the lookout for illegal activity during the 19th Purge on March 22nd, 2036, Esme Carmona notices a professor that she knows out during the Purge, which she finds very strange.
Oh no. That's Drew Adams.
You know her?
She hated this holiday. She wouldn't be outside.
If you're wondering how I know it's the 2036 Purge, it has to be after 2032, because there's a 14-year flashback to another Purge, and based on how the characters act, it isn't the first. But it has to be before 2037, because Ryan uses an ID that expires in late 2036, and it works. There is no Saturday, June 15th in that date range, but there is a Saturday, July 19th in 2036. The Eyes in the Sky agents aren't supposed to bring personal relationships into their work, but Esme becomes obsessed after watching her close friend get purged on camera, and decides to do some secret investigating on her own. She discovers that Professor Adams' home was invaded by the NFFA soldiers and comes to the conclusion that it wasn't random. Her superior at the office realizes what she's up to and threatens to reprimand her if she doesn't stop.
So take some time off, grieve for your friend, then let it go.
So she uses the free time to take to the streets to try to find out why her friend was targeted. She recovers some evidence from her house that suggests that she'd been conducting some kind of independent study on the human brain before she was purged. Esme gets in contact with one of the students looking for answers. In June 2036, the student finds her that answer when he reveals that Professor Adams was trying to hide her study because it had found proof that the NFFA had been lying about the effects of the Purge on human behavior. Their behavioral scientist, Dr. Peter Bynack, had concluded that the Purge was a catharsis, that people could let out their aggression and be fine for the rest of the year. Professor Adams' study said the opposite, claiming that engaging in violence will likely lead to the desire for more violent behavior.
Those brain scans, they show that violent acts can light up the pleasure centers of the brain like a drug.
especially those in the younger generation, those who grew up with the 28th Amendment.
I'd like to point out again that The Purge is a work of fiction, and I do not know if Professor Adams or Dr. Bynak's findings are true, and to be honest, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole in this video. They speculate that everything the NFFA has been saying about crime rates going down after the institution of The Purge may have been false data. Esme realizes she could find Professor Adams' anonymous test subjects using the facial recognition technology at her job. This would be risky because she's not supposed to use the equipment for personal reasons, but it would help her verify the results of the study. Esme's boss notices her transgressions and begins spying on her every move, with the interest of protecting the NFFA's dirty secrets. He doesn't want them to be just another regret. I'm fired. This eventually causes her to have to go on the run from the law in November as she continued her investigation. All but one of Professor Adams' test subjects were taken out along with her during the 19th Purge, and that one that they couldn't get to was illegally killed off-Purge by the NFFA, and it was covered up. So essentially, when Carmelo Johns and Dante Bishop started the anti-NFFA revolution 13 years before, they only knew about half the sins the party had committed. The reason they were able to stay in power so long was because they were using the Purge to take out anyone who might threaten their regime. So the Purge wasn't just a way for them to make money by killing the groups that they don't like, but it was also the single biggest factor contributing to keeping them in power. Esme is able to navigate the street to learn all of this because she knows where all of the dead zones are with no cameras. However, she's not able to evade them forever. She dodges a taser from an undercover FBI agent, which hilariously hits a random woman, and Esme goes on the run with her entire former workplace trying to track her movements.
We worked side by side with Esme. She was part of our family, but she has committed an act of treason. And now it is our job to protect this country by catching her.
The search for Esme becomes a priority 1 manhunt, meaning that the higher powers of the NFFA have given the visual analytics team access to private cell phone cameras in an attempt to locate her faster. She does have one friend on the inside though, a woman who worked at the desk behind her named Vivian. Esme tries blending into what appears to be a crowd of riled up sports fans, but one of their cell phone cameras captures her face, and the area is soon surrounded by armed NFFA SWAT guys. She slips away to hide out in a warehouse owned by this guy that she kind of knows. His name is Ryan Grant, and he's an ex-cop who now robs banks during the Purge. He gives her a place to lie low for a while in exchange for helping him out on their next heist, with her inside knowledge of how the NFFA operates. Meanwhile, Esme brainstorms on how she's going to expose Professor Adams' research to the public.
The NFFA just issued an alert. All citizens should be on the lookout for Esme Carmona. Looks like you're public enemy number 1.
I'm just going to assume that he manually removed all the cameras from that phone and didn't stupidly give her up to the NFFA by pointing them right at her, right? That must be what happened. Please? She helps Ryan and his team perfect their bank heist plan for the next Purge, and Vivian fills her in on what's going on at the surveillance center. The eyes in the sky expect Esme to make her move on Purge night, so everyone is alerted to look out for her. When the big night arrives, Vivian and Esme meet in secret 3 hours before commencement, and Esme asks her to falsely tag her in the system in order to distract the NFFA and allow the real Esme some wiggle room to pull off her plan.
That was a false hit on Esme. Strike team couldn't find any sign of her.
Oh, it looked like her. I'm sorry. I'm just anxious to bring her in.
Meanwhile, Esme sneaks off to a secret warehouse full of hackers who are standing by to amplify her message to as many screens as possible when the time comes. They also use a deepfake hologram of Esme to draw the guards of the surveillance center away from their posts.
Right now, you are walking down a street near that NFFA building, and there's absolutely no way they can tell it's fake.
It works. Esme's former boss dispatches his first floor security team as she sneaks up to the back door of the surveillance center. She uses a piece of technology known as a jammer to basically knock out the power in the entire building. I know, kind of OP. Unfortunately, this is the only time the existence of jammers are acknowledged in the Purge universe so far. She has a 60-second window to break into the building. Then she climbs up an IT tunnel to break into the server room and access the footage of the NFFA breaking into an innocent woman's house. The NFFA probably scrubbed the main surveillance camera footage out of existence, but this is coming from dashcam footage on a postal van that they're unlikely to know about. So she's basically using their Orwellian cameras everywhere surveillance against them. She also discovers proof that they're killing citizens off Purge. She finds that they've stepped up their security since her departure, and the ability to transfer files off of the servers has been revoked. The monitors also have some kind of screenshot blocking technology, so she improvises.
The file was protected. I couldn't transfer it outside the closed system. Don't tell me this was all for nothing. I could transfer the file within the system, so I did. To the broadcast room.
Vivian informs her that it's way too risky. Once she started broadcasting, she'd essentially be a sitting duck, and it was Purge. There's no telling what they might do to her. But that is a risk that Esme is willing to take. Vivian does her part by creating a distraction for her fellow coworkers. Or at least trying to create a distraction.
Everybody, I just want to say thank you for making my first year here so wonderful. And let's not miss anything this year. Thank you.
That won't happen here. Where is the one responsible for this?
Needless to say, one of them reports the sus activity to the boss, and he intercepts Esme and Vivian in the stairwell. Vivian takes the bullet for Esme, who promptly strikes back before infiltrating the broadcast room. This causes sirens to sound all over the building, and practically an army of guards to swarm Esme. But with added assistance of Ryan, who shows up to save her, she's able to stay alive just long enough to get her message out to the world.
You know what you found? Proof. Proof that Purge doesn't take away our anger, our hatred, and our fears. It fuels them. The reason I'm being hunted is because I discovered the truth.
Esme shows the video just as the Purge ends, and even though she should theoretically be safe until next year's Purge, the NFFA takes her out, once again proving her claim that they're taking out their opponents off Purge. However, what that officer didn't realize was that Esme never took the broadcast off the air. It became the shot heard round New Orleans. The NFFA would try to calm down the public by making the claim that what happened on the broadcast was all fake news. This was enough to convince a good amount of their supporters, but more than ever, people were waking up to their lies. I mean, I really am tired of the whole wake up people cliche, but I couldn't think of a better word to say right there. So, as usual, the Purge death toll is as high as it has ever been. But more and more, people are realizing that many of these deaths aren't the result of PvP kills, or in this case, citizen-on-citizen purging. 2 months later, in April of 2037, Vivian, who somehow survived the 20th annual Purge, joined the Resistance, which is bigger than ever thanks to Esme's contributions. The American citizens are getting angrier and angrier, and for the first time in years, new independent politicians are getting support in the polls. This political tension would reach a breaking point in 2040.
This is just one of a dozen protests around our capital after reports emerged claiming that the new founding fathers had been using the Purge to help their own economic agenda.
The presidential office is up for re-election once again, and as usual, an NFFA candidate is the favorite, but this time not by a very wide margin.
Establishment NFFA candidate Minister Edwidge Owens has been losing ground to wildcard independent candidate Senator Charlie Roan.
Roan's campaign rides on her promise to put an end to the Purge. During a meeting at the White House, the incumbent president, Caleb Warren, expresses his concern about Senator Roan's chances. He announces his disgust with the public, calling them idealistic pigs, and claiming that not everyone in a society can have it all. There simply isn't enough to go around. He stands before them in his $20 million boardroom and proclaims that it's time to do something about the NFFA's detractors, like Bishop and Roan.
We are going to use this year's Purge to do some spring cleaning, gentlemen.
Day 9429. They still have not realized that I'm not one of the boys. Section 4 of the 20th Amendment would see yet another change, this time with the immunity for government officials being removed altogether. When the NFFA press secretary Tommy Roseland presents this news, he tries to make it about fairness. His reasoning for removing the exemption is to even the playing field so that the rich and powerful are on the same level as the average citizen. However, it's clear to Roan's administration that this is really all about purging her out of the picture so they can easily take the election. It's not like the rich and powerful elites still won't be using their money to protect themselves, just as they have every year. The next debate does well for Senator Roan. Minister Owens announces that he'll be presiding over his party's Midnight Purge Mass, the next step in the evolution we've seen across the NFFA's history towards integrating the Purge into some kind of religion. Roan gains the sympathy of many voters by caring for low-income individuals who are the most endangered demographic during the Purge and spiting the NFFA and their sponsors who benefit from it. By removing the exemption for government officials, the NFFA has put Roan in a tough spot. Either she can stay home and risk being purged, or she can lock herself up in a high-security safe house, making her look rich and unrelatable to her low-income voter base, thus causing her to lose votes and probably lose the election. So she decides to stay home and let her security detail line the inside of the house with guards. Unfortunately for her, this is exactly what the NFFA was expecting, and they had men on the inside. I guess Eric and Chief Cooper were new founding fathers who took a job as part of Roan's security team some time ago as an insurance policy for the NFFA. Not sure how they got around the background check, but I'm just going to assume that the NFFA have people in high places to where something like a background check can easily be fabricated. Cooper pulls a sawtooth on the security cameras so that they're playing back recorded footage instead of a live feed, and Eric dismisses 2 of the guards by the front door so that nobody sees when all of the men outside the house are sniped down. He quietly disarms the security system and lets the NFFA's assassins into the senator's home. This time, the NFFA has hired a unit of neo-Nazi henchmen, continuing the tradition of working with modern factions of the very worst groups in human history. Many of the villains that I cover here on Horror History have some kind of gray area in their morality, but it's clear that we're just supposed to see the NFFA as just pure evil. They sweep the lower level, then make their way upstairs to the den where Roan is being kept. Eric has all the security credentials to get them into the room, but when they arrive, they discover that she's already escaped with her head security guard, Leo Barnes. The leader of the assassins is Earl Danziger, a mercenary covered from literal head to toe with the symbols of terrorist groups. He tells his men that Roan and Barnes may be outside and has them check the perimeter, but not long after, they're spotted by Cooper from the window. One of the snipers, Tommy, fires at them and manages to hit Barnes on the shoulder with a tracking bullet. But he has a clever counterattack, detonating a remote bomb he has left behind in the room that takes out everyone besides Tommy, who barely survives and loses consciousness, Danziger, who had already stepped outside, and the men who were already outside searching the perimeter. I'm guessing that qualifies as higher than a Class 4 explosive, but obeying the Purge's rules was probably the least of their concerns right now, plus Roan could always pardon him after she's won the election. Danziger orders his men to search the streets while he searches the skies. I think at this point they don't realize that the tracking bullet actually stuck in Leo's shoulder, so they don't think to check it out right away. Danziger commands his men from the helicopter when he receives word that Tommy regained consciousness. Tommy lets them know about the tracking bullet, so from that point they're able to find him and the senator fairly quickly and shoot at the triage van that they're traveling in from the chopper. They circle back around for a second round, but the van turns unexpectedly and hides under the freeway, which suggests to Danziger that she's probably still alive.
We're gonna lose him under there. Ground unit, get your moving and get here now. We got a pointer.
The ground unit follows the location of the bullet. They take the truck as far as they can, then go on foot to the waterfront, where they find the bullet discarded on the ground. Just as they realize they've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok, and flat out deceived, they're also ambushed by an aggressive group of gang members. And the last thing Danziger hears from them over the headset is gunshots and the celebration of their defeat. He commands his people to search every traffic cam in the city to find the triage van. Later that night, they find it, and at the request of Minister Owens, capture the senator alive. They bring her to the Our Lady of Sorrows church, but they were not there to solve the mystery of laceration gravity, but rather to sacrifice Senator Roan in the holiest way that they know how, at midnight Purge Mass. Once inside the cathedral, she's knocked unconscious and dressed in a white gown to be presented to Edwidge Owens and the rest of the NFFA congregation. Together, they recite the NFFA anthem, and Owens gives a sermon with a little bit of a psychotic energy.
Will sin scour, sanitize, and sterilize our souls until we are free again, and this country will be better for it.
The first purge of the evening is a martyr named Lawrence, who Owens notes was a lifelong drug addict, to keep the NFFA on brand with their desire to purge those who may require government assistance. Roan is brought out to be the next victim, the most ceremonious one of the evening. He invites all of the founding fathers to the altar to join, to, as he puts it, purge as one. But before President Warren can do the honors, they are attacked by the rebellion, and for the first time, the President of the United States is legally purged. Chaos breaks loose, and a huge firefight erupts, where many Secret Service agents get purged, but through everything, both presidential candidates manage to survive. Owens hides in a chamber below the church, but he's captured by Bishop's troops. When Dante puts the gun to his head, the minister actually begs to be purged. I think this is less of a case of Owens actually starting to believe his own phony religion, and more of a case of Owens actually starting to have been so brainwashed by his political party, he genuinely starts to value their success over his own life. If he's taken out, he becomes a martyr, and it's likely that the NFFA rallies around his replacement and it benefits their overall success. Or maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe Minister Owens just knows that he's going to lose the election after people discover what he's been hiding in the next room. More than 10 people are kidnapped, and it's likely that he planned on purging them all as part of the religious ceremony. Seeing this outrages Senator Roan, and she vows to destroy him on election day. After one last battle, Barnes and Bishop are able to take down Danziger and his men, as well as the NFFA priest Harmon James. Much was sacrificed, but Roan and Owens both survive the night in order to make it to election day. 2 months later, on May 26, 2040, the ballots are cast, and Senator Roan keeps her promise by winning Florida to push her over the top and take the election. After more than 25 years, the evil and corrupt regime known as the new Founding Fathers of America would finally come to an end. With her first executive action, President Roan would put a stop to the purge. While the NFFA's reign over the executive office had come to a conclusion, their supporters weren't about to go down without a fight.
We're just now hearing reports about a few scattered incidents around the country where NFFA supporters are reacting violently to this defeat. They are burning cars, breaking windows, looting, attacking police officers.
But with the NFFA now out of office, I'm gonna go ahead and end this video. Hopefully this helps you better understand how the NFFA operates and what their true goals and motivations were. If you love The Purge, I've got more content on the way, so go ahead and subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week. Ring that death bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive. And like The Purge, I recommend you stay home, but if you have to go out, wear a mask.